So Cubase 14 is out. You're probably watching this video to find out what new features are in there, and they are covered in this video. Not everything, but most of the things, and the things that I think are the most interesting, probably in the order that I think they're the most interesting, i.e. most interesting first. So this is an overview video. There are detailed videos elsewhere on the channel of most of these features in much more depth. And I think it's probably worth watching till the end, or probably skipping to the end if the truth be told, because in terms of upgrading, it's a little different this year than probably any other year before. Anyway, let's have a look at the features of Cubase 14. So the first feature I want to look at is modulators. So this is pretty big. This is something which Cubase has been lacking and lagging behind other DAWs, Bitwig in particular. And while it's not suddenly become Bitwig, it's got something really interesting. So this allows you to modulate pretty much anything that you can automate. So on this particular track, I've got a towel noisemaker, which is a great synth. But let's say we wanted to extend it. This allows you effectively to do this. So modulators live in the lower zone, and you can see here, there's modulators. We've got quite a few different choices. There's a full video elsewhere on the channel if you want to look at this in more depth, but ultimately it's pretty straightforward. So we can make a new LFO in this case, and then we can link it to anything that we can automate. So I'm going to click here. You can just do learn. So if I open up this particular instrument, let's just do the phase of oscillator 1. I click on there, and now you can see it's being modulated, effectively automated in an automated manner. And now that phase, you can hear that going. Obviously, that's not the greatest example, but you can imagine with a few of these modulating multiple controls, you can take a simple synth that doesn't have a lot of modulation, may have no LFOs at all, and suddenly you can control it with all sorts of possibilities here. So that's covered in full in another video on the channel in much more depth, but that's the basic idea. And for me, this is one of the knockout features of Cubase 14 because it solves a lot of problems and is going to make a lot of things much easier. Next is the drum track and the pattern editor. So these kind of come as a 2-for-1, but you can use them separately from each other. So you can not use the pattern editor with the drum machine, and you can use the pattern editor with something else if you want. But here we are. It's basically giving you an alternative to Groove Agent. But as you'll see in the full video on the channel, there's much more to it than that. So we'll just load up a simple preset. So let's just load up Beat Starter 1. We've actually got a drum synth, so it's not just sample based. There's lots to play around with. You can see we've got plenty of controls here. If we move to this, each one of these, you can see there's a world of controls here. In addition to this, we also get by default the pattern editor. So this may look familiar to you, depending on which DAWs you've worked on in the past. Again, there's another video on this elsewhere on the channel because it's a pretty interesting feature. I like it. It gives you a lot of instant playability, but also a lot of creating things randomly, etc., which is quite nice. So it's pretty easy to generate a straightforward beat, for instance, just by doing the usual kind of stuff. But there's much, much more to it than this. And in fact, we can just do this with these buttons, or make every third or fourth, etc., that kind of thing. And then straight away, we've generated the world's most boring drum pattern, but you get the idea. And so there's a full video elsewhere on the channel, so you can see there's much more to it than this. Go through pretty much all the features and all the kind of things you can use it for. Probability and variance is another thing I'm pretty excited about. Again, fairly simple, fairly straightforward, but makes everyday work in a DAW much easier and also makes your end result more interesting. So we've got the ability to control the probability of a note playing, which starts out at 100%, but let's say we want to make some of these around the 50% mark. And we've also got the ability to alter the velocity effectively randomly, but we can control the variance of it. So if I play this back, instead of it being the same mundane you would have expected, we can get something where some of these notes won't happen with a bit of luck. So you get the idea there. There's a full video on this elsewhere on the channel. Goes in a bit more detail to this, and also how you can use it in some slightly more interesting manners, particularly when combined with the pattern editor. event volume curves are something which has been neglected for a long time in Cubase. So they were pretty basic. So they have been drastically changed. But in addition, there's another change which I'm still not used to yet. I'm still not sure it's a great idea, which is the overall volume of a audio event is now controlled with this fader here rather than with the square handle which used to appear at the top. I get the rationale for that. I just don't like it because years of muscle memory have now been destroyed. But there we go. The event volume curve, if you select the pencil, you will see it's currently on a 0 dB flat line, as you would expect, but then you can draw in what you want. So we can draw, click and drag. We can add curves, all sorts of stuff. So this is much more capable than the previous one, which was pretty basic. And I'd be honest, I didn't use it a great deal because I found it just sort of basic and annoying. It was difficult to handle. It just wasn't the kind of thing that I wanted to do. This works much better. You can use the range selection tool, so you can edit these using the range selection tool. You can also select an area and then edit multiple things with the kind of tools you're used to. So where you can effectively fade things in, fade things out, ironically control the volume with the handle at the top middle, and also scale it around the center. So this gives you plenty of options to create this event volume curve, which is a different thing from automation volume, because this is effectively controlling the pre-signal chain volume of the audio event, which can give you significantly different results depending on what you're doing. So it's nice to have this. Again, there's a video in more depth on the channel showing everything you can do with this, but this is nice to have, but I wish it hadn't come with this because I don't know how many years it is I've been using that handle, but every single time I reach up for it, I get annoyed. I'm sorry. That's just how I am. I guess I'm too old to change. The score editor has been completely revamped. So Steinberg has had its Dorico scoring application available for a number of years, and for probably most of those years, people have been saying, why can't you integrate Dorico's functionality into Cubase for the score editor? It's finally happened after a fashion. So this isn't Dorico. This is some of Dorico's skills and powers being integrated into the score editor. So if I just open this part up, we will see that straight away it looks a lot better than anything that Cubase had, but it works much more like Dorico did, or does rather. It's much better, but this is a complete wholesale change. The other thing to note about this is that it really highlights the way that the two development teams work differently, because Cubase's development team tends to set a bunch of features and release kind of when they're ready. I mean, not entirely for reasons to do with software and malarkey, but Dorico tends to say that they will be released during the course of that particular cycle. So Cubase 14 is getting mostly finished audio Cubase features, as it were, but the scoring part is still going to have some extra things added. So one of the things which is missing, which is the thing I would probably use the most, is tablature. So tablature is currently not supported, but it is slated for some point in the 14 release cycle. I don't know when exactly, but that's what I've heard. So it should be out at some point, but it's not at the moment, which for me, I'm a guitarist. That's most of the stuff that I do is that. So if it's not tab, I tend to look at it less, but it's definitely a wholesale revision of the score editor. So this is not your Cubase score editor. This is the new Cubase score editor. I'm hoping to do a complete video on it on the channel, but because there's so much to do, and also because I have a hard deadline in terms of when I will no longer be able to make any videos for quite a while, it may not happen. So if it's not on the channel, my apologies. If it is on the channel, it's probably what I've done. The manual is significant. It's over 100 pages, so there's plenty to learn in there. I'm hoping to cover that, but if not, get in there and explore. But it's certainly, if you know Dorico, you will find some things which will be common, but it is definitely not Dorico squeezed into Cubase. But there will be some inter-app functionality, so you'll be able to export to Dorico, and I believe import Dorico as well. So the communication between the two should be better. But it will be a bit of a learning curve, but I'm sure it'll be worth it, because it certainly was the case that Dorico was worth the learning curve, because in terms of getting scoring done, for me, for my limited scoring use, it's been absolutely fantastic. I'm not doing, weird Gregorian chants or nose flutes or any other esoteric instruments, but for the day-to-day work, which I have done, it's been great. I expect this to be somewhere in between, but if you want to do serious score editing, Dorico will still be your thing. But if you want to quickly knock up a score of something you're doing in Cubase, this will be a much better option than the original score editor. So Media Bay has been improved in a number of ways. One of the things of an upcoming release is that the search is much faster. So if you've got a lot of samples, you'll probably know it can get bogged down in searching, and it's quite a bit quicker. But the previewer has been improved. So when you're listening to something in Media Bay, and I would encourage you to use Media Bay, the previewer has been improved with a few sort of quality of life improvements, but they are quite good. So firstly, these buttons make a lot more sense to me than they used to. The other ones were always a head scratcher. So that's good. The play here now just works in the way you'd expect, and you can cycle it. You've got volume control, which is good as well. But importantly, here we've got some changes which make it much more worthwhile. Firstly, you can link to the transpose track. So this will automatically follow the transpose track for the preview that you're doing. So this current sample here is just in E minor. So if I play it without that turned on, you get the idea. It's the same pretty much all the way through, apart from this end section. Now, if we turn this on, it will follow the transpose which I've got in the track. So if we just have a quick look at that, you can see I've put in 0 at the beginning, then I've put in 3 semitones, then 5, and then I've gone up an octave, and it will ignore the octave. It'll just go back to the key where it was. So if we play this now from the beginning, you'll see here it will change, and then here it will change. So have a listen for that. Coming up. And coming up again. And then it will go back to... That's in the sample. So when it gets to 12, it just goes back to 0, which is good. So it's quite nice that. You can also force it to a key, given that if it knows the key, then it will force it. So here it will put it in C, for instance. So you don't have to import it and faff around with it. And you can also half. It's fitting it to the tempo here, but it's doing it in a way like half or double. I would use that a lot, actually, because it's pretty good to be able to do this. Often I find I want something at half or double speed, and you're like, is that going to work or not? Because often the idea might work, but the groove doesn't, etc. So this allows you to audition it much more simply. And then we've got tape machine style, which again, quite fun. So speed and pitch are linked as they would be on a traditional analog tape machine. Again, only small changes, but I quite like them because I use Media Bay a fair bit, particularly when I'm putting things together quickly as an example for somebody. And it's nice to be able to do this because this is going to mean it's much easier to work out whether something's going to work without you having to import into your project and then find out you've made the worst decision ever. So the range tool has seen some changes and potentially improvements. So the first thing is if you double click with the range tool between two events, the range will be created between them, which makes a fair bit of sense. If you do it between the beginning of the project and the first event, it will do it there. And if you do it after the last event, it will do nothing because obviously it would need to do it for infinity. So these make sense because they're often the kind of things you want to be able to grab. Another useful thing is the range remains after you've edited. So I've got this range selected here. If I then go off and do some other stuff, so let's just pencil in some madness over here. If we come back to the range tool, it will remain in place. So that's quite handy because you might have forgotten to do something or you might just want to come back to it, etc. So it's quite nice that. Another useful thing is previously, let's say you'd drawn too big a range and you wanted to make it smaller. Previously, you'd need to click over here and then redraw your smaller range. That's no longer the case now. You can hold down the Shift key and then just redraw inside there. If you are outside the existing range, so let's say we'll draw that, you can make it bigger by holding down the Shift key and expanding it that way as well. So it gives you the option to redraw it in a number of ways, which are pretty useful. So it's only small stuff, but if you use the range tool a lot, I think you'll find that useful. There's a preference to change the way the range tool moves. So if we look at the default, so if we select this range here over these parts, the default will just slice those out as you would expect. However, but it's also possible to change this. So if we go under preferences and then look under editing, you'll see in the sea of things here, and they're not together. Let's not put them in any kind of order that makes sense. Range tool splits partially selected events. So if you untick that, now when we do this, you will see that only the events which are entirely encompassed by that will be taken. So if that's the way you want it to work, if it's more like a selectable grab, I can see some situations where that would be useful, but it's quite different from the way the range tool works by default. So it's good to have options. It would be nice if those options were in any sensible way at all, because I've lost count of the number of times I've scratched my head to try and find a preference, and there's no searchable preferences, and they're not even in order. So look at this here. So we've got a range tool one here, and we've got a range tool one here. Yeah, even if you know it's there, it's sometimes easy to miss, and sometimes you don't even know where these things are. So this is definitely something which does need fixing soon. You can nudge audio events, which you've selected with the range tool. So that's now highlighted, and if I hold down Command and use the cursor keys, or Control and cursor keys on Windows, you can move these around. So if you want to do that kind of thing, that's probably going to be nice and easy. It's a kind of tool, if you spend more time with it, you're probably going to use it more. But there we go. It's also possible to toggle the mute status for audio events in a range selection. So there we've got that range selected, and I can Option or Alt-M, and that will mute those, which wasn't the case before. There's a number of other ones. So if you want to look at this in detail, I would suggest you look at the documentation, because there's loads of little changes with this. If you use the range tool a lot, you're probably going to notice them pretty much straight away or be able to enable them. If you don't use the range tool a lot, you probably go, I don't care. But there we go. So the range tool has seen some improvements. There are a number of new effects. The effect that you get depends on the version of Cubase you're using. These are covered in some depth in a separate video, so I'd advise you to go and look at that. But the idea is we've got this shimmer reverb, which is fun for some applications. We've got studio delay, which is giving us more than your just standard delay. So plenty of things to play around there. We've got auto filter. Oh, here shimmer's still going now. Very good. So we've got an audio driven filter here, which is, again, covered in the full video in a bit more depth. We've got underwater. I think we get the idea with that, but again, that's covered in slightly more depth in the video. And then finally, we've got volume. So this is mostly for use with modulators. So it's just a volume control, but it means you don't end up with faders going up and down all the time while you're using the modulators for volume control. So it's not much easier to deal with automation on top of that, etc. So this is fairly workmanlike, but quite useful. Supervision has been given some more options in terms of color. So these are apparently aimed at colorblind people, but they'll certainly brighten up your Supervision display, even if you're not colorblind. So when you open this up, in many of the modes, not all of them, but many of them, you have got an option to control what's happening in terms of color. So if I play this track in the background, we can see the top one I've already changed. This bottom one is in the default, but we can click the cog and then we can pick the color mapping. So you can have it in frequency or intensity, and then you can pick the colors as well. So it's following the track by default, but we've got all sorts of different mappings of intensities and colors. So this certainly can either brighten things up or make it much easier to see what's going on. Certainly that one, not sure about, but everybody's different. So this is aimed predominantly at colorblind people, and certainly the majority of people who are using this software are male. That's a reflection of society, etc. The reasons for this are not clear, because it's certainly not the case that women can't do a good job. Certainly my experience of teaching a number of very, very talented women over the years is that they are every bit as capable as men, but we are where we are. But certainly 8% of the males who are using the program will be colorblind to one degree or another, some really profoundly colorblind. So this is just something that everybody should just be doing. So it's good to see this in here. Hopefully it will follow through to some of the rest of the user interface, which is definitely not colorblind friendly in quite a few places. I've moaned about this enough. There's a video elsewhere on the channel. Sermon over. Now, this is a small one, but it's definitely, in the case of at last, this is going to save me having to swap back to the project window quite a lot. You can move tracks around in the mixer. So you can just click and drag them. You see the traditional brightly colored line shows you where you're moving it to. So you can see I can move this back. You can move a number of them if you want. So I'll just click and drag those, and you can see they are now in the right place. And we can see that in the background, the project window is following that. You can unlink that if you want, but I don't see any reason to confuse myself further. We can also get a context menu. So we can see, apart from anything else, we can move the selected channels to some places. I'm just going to move this up so we see it in the screen capture area. Move selected channels is still off the bottom. It's like Steinberg hates me. But there's options. You can move into a new folder or to the last. So I'm going to put these to the last available position. Trust me, that's what I'm doing. And it moves them to there. So this is something that I'll probably use a lot, particularly in bigger sessions, because you end up in a bit of a mess and then you're in the mixer and you want to move things around and get them all where they should be, etc. And managing larger sessions is definitely something which you need to spend some time doing. Again, simple tools, but it will give you a chance to do this a bit better. And undo and redo is supported. So look, we can see undo moves to selected tracks. So this is nice because not everything which has been added into 14 is supported in undo and redo. So quite a few things just don't do that, and you'll hammer away on undo and then realize it's not undone it, but it's undone something else that you wanted to keep. I've definitely done that. I've done that quite a lot. For a long time, it's not been possible to translate projects between DAWs. Now, the DAW project file format is an attempt to rectify this, and Cubase 14 supports this. I've had mixed results with this. Certainly, I found that things that I'd recorded via VST Connect made it not work in the import that I was trying to do it with. But in theory, it's fairly straightforward. You should just be able to go to File, Export, then DAW Project. Choose a name for your project. So I'll just call it this one. It saves it. And it's a monolithic file. It's a big file with all the audio, etc. in there. And then you can send it easily. And also you will be able to load it up, hopefully in other DAWs which support it. So let's just take a look at this in Bitwig. So here we just open it like any other file. I'll go and find that export that I just did. And with a bit of luck, we should see it will open it up. Now, this particular one, it's got too many tracks for the version of Bitwig that I've got, but you can see that that's imported that. It's followed a lot of the structure, including putting those in a folder, the colors to a degree, etc. So it's certainly much better than the old thing of sending out stems and then trying to recreate the project. It's definitely limited. It doesn't work perfectly, but it's better than the alternative of just sending out raw unprocessed stems and then writing down everything and trying to get all that done. And you can see that the edits, etc., have been respected here. So it's certainly not perfect, but it's definitely better than nothing. So there's a number of smaller changes, which I'm just going to cover briefly here. So first things first is performance is supposed to be improved because of some optimization with Cubase's programming to do with data structures, if you're into that kind of programming stuff. So hopefully this should have a positive impact on larger projects, etc., and loading and saving. It seems to be snappier for me, but I've not done any specific benchmarking, but it seems to be improved in this respect. Right, so another change which has been made is a 64-bit project file has been recently introduced in Cubase. So if you're using Cubase 13.030 or older, if you make a project file which is larger than 2 gigs, so this is your project file, not the audio files that are associated with it, but the actual project file, it will save it in a 64-bit format. That is the default for 14. So if you create a project with 14 and try and open it up with an older version of Cubase, such as Cubase 12, it won't work. Later versions of Cubase 13 will be able to open them, but it could still shoot you in the foot. It's something that actually I shot myself in the foot with while I was playing around with this and moving things between different versions. So just be aware of that. Generally, it won't be a problem, but occasionally it might be. Just be aware. The autosave functionality has been overhauled. So on screen, you can see a folder. So in your project folder, you'll have an autosaves folder rather than the back files. So these are all these backup files. And rather than being saved in the project folder, they will be saved in the autosaves folder, which is much better. You're not getting it all cluttered up. And I've had so many people confused by these files, particularly if you have file name extensions turned off. It can be really confusing. But what's nice is the names make a bit more sense because it's now saying the last thing that you did with it. So for instance, these ones here, you can see I did a variety of different actions and it's saying what the last action was done before that file was saved, which can be useful, particularly if you're in a situation where when you did the next thing, it made it crash. So this provides much nicer functionality, even though it's pretty simple, but it's much better. If you're on Windows, you'll notice some changes to the way the menu bar looks, etc. So it should look more in keeping with the theme and light and dark mode that you've got selected. But I still find I liked the old version where you had the project name in the middle on the bar. There we go. But we're not going back to that. So I just need to let that go. If you double click on a MIDI track or instrument track, you can create a single bar part, which is quite useful because previously you would have needed to set your locators as I'm doing on screen and then double click between them. But if you double click now, you just get a single bar part, which is quite nice, a quicker thing. And there's a bunch of key commands which are added to allow you to create macros to do a lot of things, which is quite nice. It's also possible to have the full mix console in the lower zone. And the lower zone has been expanded to remember heights for different elements. So you can see here chord pads, editor, and so on. It's much more expanded compared to how it used to be. So as a result, there's more happening. You're going to be using the lower zone more for sure. I think it's one of those things where initially there was a lot of resistance to it. Certainly I was like, why have we got that? And now I use it probably half the time, I'd say. Sometimes I use pop-out editors. Sometimes I use it. Depends on what's going on. But I quite like it, having it in the editor, for having it synchronized and visible when maybe I'm aligning something to what's going on here. I don't want to use edit in place, and it just makes it nice and easy to work with. So it's one of those things that's taken, I don't know, 10 years to get used to, but finally I've given in. Another thing you can see on screen is it's now all one program. So when you load it, you can press the Alt or Option key, and then you can choose which version of the program you're running, which is lower than the license you got. So if you've got a Cubase Pro license, you can run any of them all the way down to AI. If you've got an artist license, you can't obviously run Pro, but you could run Elements, etc. This can be useful for checking if features are there, particularly if you're in education or working in different studios and so on, or if you're sharing something with a friend, etc. So it's useful to be able to do this. We could previously do it to a limited degree, but now you can go all the way down to AI, which is much nicer than the previous version where you had to somehow get hold of a license for it and muck around, and it was much more painful for me, certainly. So it makes it much easier for me to check, for instance, that a certain function is missing or present in any given version, rather than trying to find a chart which shows whether that's there or not. So don't panic if you read what's on screen. VST2 is included in Cubase 14, but it's turned off by default, so you will need to turn it on. This is something I'm just doing a quick separate video on the channel, which you can find out how to do it. It's pretty straightforward, and then everything will work as you would expect. But Cubase 14 disables VST2 by default, so if you don't turn it on and you load up a project with it in, you will have a problem because it just won't work. It will think that plugin isn't there. We'll cover that in more detail in the video separately, but it's certainly something that's worth pointing out because you may have a bit of a horror moment when you first open it up after you've upgraded to Cubase 14, should you choose to do so. So there you have a whistle-stop tour of the new features of Cubase 14 as I see them. Upgrading this year is a little different from all the other years ever. Normally, I say, you know, if the feature's there and the things that you want, then it's time to upgrade. That's definitely the case. So, you know, if you are someone who's already on Steinberg licensing, so if you're on Cubase 12 or 13, it's up to you. If you're on an earlier version, i.e. you're still using a dongle, so you're on Cubase 11 or earlier, as far as I understand it, this is the last time you'll be able to upgrade to the newest version of Cubase. Because the e-licenser service is closing down at some point next year, I think this is the last time you'll be able to upgrade, and next version of Cubase, which will probably be out in a year or so, that won't be the case. You will have to buy it outright because the servers won't exist to do the upgrade and mark the license as upgraded and this, that, and the other. So if that timeline holds, and I think it probably will, although I don't know any more than just literally what Steinberg have said in public, this might be your last chance to upgrade. I think that's also borne out by the fact that the upgrade price from earlier versions is being reduced. They're being much more generous in terms of letting old versions like Cubase 7 and 8, etc., upgrade at the same price as if you're on Cubase 11, because they want everybody to be on Steinberg licensing and be up to date. So it muddies the water a little bit. Obviously, in previous years, an older version wouldn't have got the same amount of money. And if you dropped off the bottom of the list, which I will put on screen, then you wouldn't have got effectively an upgrade anyway. You would have been buying outright. But this is probably the time to jump because they want to corral everybody into Steinberg licensing land instead of having people disgruntled that they've still got e-licenses. It doesn't stop you using your old version. You can do all that, etc. But it may swing you one way or the other. As ever, hope you found this video useful, and please like, comment, subscribe, etc. and look at other videos on the channel because there's quite a bit. I've gone maybe a little too deep on some areas, but anyway, they're a nice long watch, and apparently that's what people want on YouTube. So settle in, grab a bag of crisps or a healthy snack for that matter. Get yourself a nice apple, maybe a banana or some kiwi fruit, and then sit down for a couple of hours and watch all the other stuff, going through all the other features before you decide to spend your hard-earned cash on some more software. Anyway, hope you found this video useful, and we'll see you again soon-ish for more Music Tech Tuition.